Hey everyone, Azim here. We are talking about the thoracic cage. We are still in chapter 7, the axial skeleton. We are wrapping up our discussion of the axial skeleton. Slide 26 is where we're starting. We'll start here with the slides and then we'll switch over to complete anatomy. So the thoracic cage it's cage-like a cage. It's kind of got bars or wires, and those are the ribs that are surrounding and protecting our organs, really, really vital organs, namely the heart, the lungs, trachea, esophagus, but mostly the heart and lungs are what you think is very vital. By having a rib-like, or by having ribs, by having a cage-like structure, this allows for expansion and recoil of our thoracic cage. It allows for us to breathe, for us to respire. And there are muscles attached to the ribs that allow for movement for breathing. There are muscles that allow us to position our vertebral column attached to the thoracic cage. And we'll see later how this is important for movement as well of our pectoral, urinal, and our upper limbs. You'll notice that our ribs make a very interesting shape on the anterior side. Really, the cartilage of the ribs make an interesting shape. There's this curvature here. There's this curvature here on the anterior side formed by the cartilage, the costal cartilages. The term for this is the costal margin. The word margin just means border. It's the border of the ribs on the anterior side. This costal margin is an arch formed by the false ribs and one true rib, the cartilages of the false rib and true ribs. We'll get to those ribs here in a second. But you have this border because this is the resting position of the main muscle of breathing of the diaphragm. It's the main resting position of the diaphragm. It's curved up. When you breathe, the diaphragm flattens to make your thoracic cavity larger. More volume, decreased pressure, you get air to flow in. That's how you breathe in. We'll talk about that in more detail later. But the costal margin has that shape for that reason. There are spaces in between your ribs. All those spaces in between your ribs, those are called intercostal spaces. They allow for space for your ribs to expand, for your thoracic cage to expand rather, and recoil, but also you have muscles in between that allow for the breathing, nerves, blood vessels, lymph vessels passing in between. The sternum is the most anterior, most medial portion of your thoracic cage. Your sternum used to be 3 different bones. Just like how your frontal bone used to be 2, your mandible used to be 2, your sacrum used to be 5, your coccyx used to be 2 to 3. Sternum used to be 3 bones. They fused together. This top part is called the manubrium. It's handle-shaped. That's what the manu comes from. Like these are your manual regions. You do things by hand, you do it manually. It's handle-shaped. The manubrium articulates with your clavicles. The clavicular notch is this portion of the manubrium that articulates with clavicles. And then there's this medial portion called the jugular notch. It's the indentation at your throat, also part of the manubrium. The manubrium is kind of at an angle with the rest of the sternum. If you look at this sagittal view, this mid-sagittal view, there's kind of a slightest angle between your manubrium and the rest of the sternum. That's called the sternal angle. Sternal angle. The sternal angle is right here. The largest portion of your sternum This is your body of the sternum. We've used that word a lot, body of vertebrae, body of the hyoid. Here's the body of the sternum. It's the middle portion. It has most of the articulations for your ribs. There is one articulation, well, 1.5. There's an articulation for your first rib with the manubrium, for your second rib spanning between the manubrium and the body, and then for the rest of your ribs down here, mostly on the body. A part of it can go to the last portion here. This last sharp portion of your sternum is the xiphoid process. X is pronounced as a Z, xiphoid process. Xiphoid means sword-like. It's sharp, you can feel it. This is the anterior attachment point for your diaphragm. It's a good border distinction between your thoracic cavity and your abdominal pelvic cavity. It's where we dissected those fetal pigs to make that first incision. Yeah, that's the sternum. It's a flat bone, medial portion of your chest, thoracic area, sternal region, attachment for your ribs and clavicles. There are 12 pairs of ribs. It's easiest to count them from a posterior view. It's easiest to count them from a posterior view because not all of them wrap around to the front. So there are 12 pairs. You can count them all here. There's 12, one on either side. The first seven are called your true ribs. The first 7 are called your true ribs. If you look on the anterior side, all 7 have their own costal cartilage connecting to the sternum. They connect with their own costal cartilages. Costal cartilages are made of hyaline that allows them some flexibility, but a bit of strength for protection, flexibility so they can move as you breathe. So offers a mix of flexibility and strength. Not the most flexible like elastic, not the strongest like fibrocartilage, it's in between. True ribs are called true because they have their own costal cartilages. The false ribs are still ribs, but numbers 8, 9, and 10, they connect to the sternum with a fused cartilage. 8, 9, and 10 connect to the cartilage of number 7, to the costal cartilage of number 7. Those are your false ribs. 11 and 12 are also called false ribs, but more specifically, they do not have any cartilage that attaches to the sternum. They do connect on the posterior side to your vertebrae, but they do not connect on the anterior side. So they're called your floating ribs. They're not truly floating. Your only truly floating bone is your hyoid because it's not articulating with any bones. 11 and 12 ribs do connect to the 11 and 12 thoracic vertebrae, but they're colloquially known as your floating ribs. If we isolate a rib, here's a left rib, here's a right rib, here's the sternum on the anterior side, costal cartilage, and a thoracic vertebra. We can see it forms a ring of this whole cage. The head of the rib is posterior and it connects with the body of the thoracic vertebra that it articulates with. The head articulates with the body. The tubercle is this protrusion of the rib that isn't quite at the end, so it's not the head, but it still pokes out. The tubercle articulates with the transverse process. So the head of the rib articulates with the body. the tubercle articulates with the transverse processes of these thoracic vertebrae. The other end, the anterior end of the rib, articulates with costal cartilage, and then the costal cartilage articulates with the sternum. So there's a piece of cartilage in between the rib and the sternum. So as you can see, wrapping up about the axial skeleton, we can see that there's important parts of the axial skeleton that has holes in it to allow for nerves and allow us to perceive the world. It acts as an axis, it's a central plane. There's curvatures, like our spinal curvatures and curvatures of the skull. And we just saw our thoracic cage. I'm going to go switch over to complete anatomy to show you these bones in a bit more detail. Here we are in an anterior view. You can see the sternum here. The manubrium, whoops. Body and the xiphoid process. You can see the clavicle articulating here and here on the manubrium. That is the clavicular notch on either side. The jugular notch is this portion up here. And the sternal angle, which you can't really appreciate from this angle, from this view, would be at this junction between the manubrium and the body. We'll go more lateral here in a minute. We can see the costal cartilages of rib 1 articulating here at the manubrium, rib 2 articulating between the manubrium and the body, rib 3 at the body, rib 4, rib 5, rib 6, and you'll have to trust me that this is rib 7. The first 7 ribs have their own cartilages articulating with the sternum. Rib 7 can articulate with the body, sometimes also with the xiphoid process. It just depends on the person. From a posterior, or sorry, let's look at that lateral view. Let's look at the sternal angle. There's a little bit of an angle between the manubrium and the body. That's the sternal angle. I'm not going to have you fully differentiate between all the different ribs, but you can see that there's a pattern between the ribs. The first rib is very short, very curved, and pretty flat. The first rib is short, very curved and flat. The ribs get bigger and longer the farther down you go until you get to a point. Once you get to the false ribs, they start getting smaller and thinner. The floating ribs are the least curved and the thinnest. So here is number 11, and here is number 12. Number 12 has the least curvature, it's the shortest and the least curved. Did I say that already? It's the least curved and shortest and thinnest. What they all have in common though, all these ribs, they do articulate with the thoracic vertebrae. So let me just pick one here in the middle. All right, so I've isolated a few things here. First, I've chosen a false rib. It's not a floating rib. I've chosen a false rib. This is number 8. You can see that number 8, its costal cartilage is shared with 9 and 10 and fuses with number 7. That's why they're called false ribs, because they don't have their own cartilage. They have to fuse together with number 7 in order to connect to the sternum. On the posterior side, you can see the head of the rib articulating with the articular facets. Let me hide this rib. Or with the costal facets, excuse me, with the costal facets. Those are costal facets on the body. And then let me add the rib back in. The tubercle of the rib is poking out this way. I'll give you a better view. But the tubercle of the rib also articulates with the costal facet, but it's on the transverse process. So I'm going to clear this. Let's look at a different angle. Let's look at a superior view. I'm going to hide this one. And you can see the head of the rib, and then this protrusion is the tubercle. The tubercle articulates with the transverse process of the thoracic vertebra. All right, that wraps up chapter 7, axial skeleton. In the next chapter, we'll go over the appendicular skeleton. I will see you there. Let me know if you have any questions. Leave questions and comments in the discussion. Yeah, I'll talk to y'all later.